Alright, hello everyone, welcome back to another video. The last few days I have been over in the Gold Coast here in Australia playing in a 9-round chess tournament. All in all, not a particularly amazing tournament this year in general, as I've been coming back to chess. Last year I barely played any chess, I took a bit of hit to my rating, and unfortunately this tournament was not really an exception to that. Not quite sure how much I lost yet, but to be honest, rather not think about it. I'll also probably make another video just about this tournament, recapping it a bit, not going into as much detail as I will for this game in this video, but I think that will be useful for some of you guys, hopefully. So anyways though, what happened in this game here and why am I showing this to you guys? And well, basically this game is probably, as you can tell by the title of the video, one of the best games that I've played this year. And honestly, maybe one of the best games I've just ever played, period. And to give you some context for who my opponent was, he might even be watching, I have no idea. I was basically playing this guy Lewis Chan. He's like around the same age as me, maybe a year younger. But when I used to live in Melbourne, now I live in Sydney here in Australia, I basically just played him a shit ton of times. I played him maybe like 10 times in classical and a bunch of other times in rapid, and cumulatively in like our 10 or so classical games, I didn't even win a single one. You know, I definitely had this sort of psychological block coming into the game. I haven't played in many years because I moved away from Melbourne when I was younger. That's a whole story in of itself. But you know, playing someone who you just have this very long history with, you play them in all sorts of games, you never won a single one of them despite having all these good positions, you know, it can definitely affect your psychology coming into the game. But nonetheless, you know, I was ready to go and I was sticking to my guns. I started with 1d4 as we have on the board already. And before the game, for context for my opponent's next move, which was a6, which looks a little bit stupid, right? Basically, we were sort of having a little bit of pre-game banter, and Lewis said something along the lines of like, oh, I've watched all your YouTube videos, I know what to play against 1d4, and then I replied like, oh, you 1a6, right? And I was just kind of, you know, like joking around with him, and then he spent like a minute or two maybe thinking about this move on move 1, and then played a6. And I thought the guy was kind of crazy at first, but I was like, okay, whatever, I'll just play e4, I'll just play principled. And usually when they do this, I think this is called the Miles defense, something they go b5, and it's not good, but at the same time, it's like not terrible. You go e6, c5, breaking the center at some point. Usually not something you'd play against someone of your own level or in a very serious game like this. But nonetheless, we in this position, instead of having b5, we actually had d6, and the game very soon transposed actually into somewhat of a normal King's Indian type position, except we have this somewhat weird move a6 for black. And by the way, I could also play something like knight c3, but you have to keep in mind that you could potentially transpose into an opening such as the modern now, where a6 is actually very standard. And also given the fact that I'm not really a 1e4 player, I don't really deal with the modern, or if I do, like after d4, g6, I'll put a pawn on c4, I won't go for these positions like where I have a knight blocking it, right? This didn't really make much sense, so I had to be a little bit careful and at least conscious of the fact that I could be getting tricked into some position that I don't really want to play, which is why I sort of played in this more King's Indian style fashion when now Lewis played c5. I should also note that, you know, of course, it's usually black's move in this position. If the pawn was back on a7, then they'd play e5. They could go c5 in that position as well. Or sometimes they even go knight a6, but of course, that's not legal. And also, I should note that the king would still be back on e1 rather, if the pawn was back on e7. But yeah, I think c5 was probably the best move in this position, because if you go e5 now, the problem with these sorts of positions are that you've sort of wasted a tempi compared to the normal variations. And I was thinking during the game, maybe what I'll do is not even push d5, but actually maybe just take on e5, takes, and play knight d5 and go for something like an exchange variation, where now black is essentially a tempi down because they've wasted this move with a6 compared to the normal variations. And I was thinking on a concrete level that that could actually be quite, you know, dangerous for black. So that's why Lewis played c5, I think. And here I had a bit of a decision, because the thing is I could play d5. This looks like a very natural move, gain space and going into somewhat of a Benoni structure. However, after e6, I have to admit, you know, black taking at some point, I don't really play these Benoni lines with a bishop on e2, so I would effectively be getting move ordered into something which I don't really know so well, and I didn't really want to go into that. There is also potentially like even b5, but to be honest, I think this is a not very dangerous version of the Benko Gambit, because in a lot of these lines in the accepted, white often, like say if we go to these positions, right, just putting all these moves on the board in case those of you do not know what I am talking about, where, you know, white has to take with the king on f1 when they play e4, whereas in these lines, of course, we didn't have to go through that. which I believe would make this somewhat of an improved version. But with that being in mind, the main reason I avoid this being e6 and going to this Benoni theme, which I didn't really know so well. I mean, of course I know the Benoni structures, but this specific sort of version I'm not too comfortable with, I would say. I decided to go for rook e1 in this position, where I keep the tension and now sort of hand the ball over to black, and ask them what are they going to do. And most often what they will do is take on d4, and after knight takes d4 go into a Maroczy bind structure, which I am very comfortable with. But just briefly before we talk more about this, I was also thinking about during the game something like b3, because the thing is sometimes when you play rook e1 is that sometimes you actually don't want your rook in the square. I know we're getting a bit deeper into the minutiae maybe of this opening, but very often you might want your rooks on b1 and c1 eventually, for example. But there was a sort of concrete problem with b3, which I'm not sure is 100% correct yet. I haven't checked this with an engine, but b5 looked quite annoying during the game. When it was something like d takes e5, I could potentially be running into something like knight takes e4, and if I play c takes b5, winning a pawn like this, then I thought I'd run into queen a5. My knight is being attacked, I can't move this way because then the bishop hangs, and if I play bishop b2 you might ask what's the problem, and maybe white has something here, but I didn't think so after knight takes e4, when now they win a pawn, and, well, they're winning the pawn back rather I should say, and after takes, I felt like I would probably just be worse. Black has this very nice, just one solid pawn island, they're equal in material, their pieces just seem more active. Yeah, I was not willing to sign up for this. So yeah, that's why I played rook e1, just sort of a waiting move. Like if they play knight c6, I just kick them back with d5, and now we get the Benoni structure, but they're just way behind and tempi and stuff. Not good for them. They could also maybe play bishop g4, but I was just going to go bishop e3, and if they play knight c6 and go for something like this, for example, now I have the bishop pair, the knight is sort of waiting to get kicked around by something like f4. I didn't think this was so good for black. So that's why in this position, rook e1 is once again, I thought quite strong. C takes d4, and we get this Maroczy structure. But, even despite what I was saying, the rook being on e1, its role isn't exactly too clear right now. Black also has sort of played this move a6, when very often these Maroczy bind structures, what they want to do is eventually play a5. There are some plans where you try and go a6, b5, but in this position at least, it doesn't feel so easy to get that in. So what happened here was rook c8, and already this potentially could have been where my opponent went wrong. And also I should say, when he transposes his whole Maroczy structure, well, I was very comfortable with these sorts of positions. I played them with the white side before, maybe not so much in tournament games, but definitely online I've had a bit of experience with them. I've studied them in all sorts of classical games and stuff, and I've even played it a bit on the black side. But say something that would resemble somewhat of a more normal plan, I think, for black is maybe something like takes, bishop c6, say go queen d2, knight d7. Black offers up a trade of dark squared bishops, which to some people might look wrong, because often we're taught if you have a fianchettoed bishop, you should avoid trading at all costs. But this is a sort of exception in Maroczy, because our king is located on the king side. It's very unlikely we're going to start pushing these pawns, and with all our pawns on light squares, trading the dark squared bishops for white actually is quite risky from a strategic point of view, and we are best off avoiding it. Which is why in this position we'd probably play something like bishop e3, black will try going a5, white will probably prevent a4, as now a4 will be met by b4, black will then probably play something like knight d5, while we'll play rook b1, gain the rook over this diagonal, and our long-term plans play something like a3 b4 probably, kicking their pieces back and gaining some space on the queen's side. But yeah, the game, it took a very different direction. Rook c8 happened, queen d2, takes, bishop e6, and this is a little bit strange, but again, my opponent, he wasn't so familiar with these sorts of positions, so it's difficult for him to really know what to do in some sense, because these Maroczy positions, if you've never played them before with black, it is sort of difficult to know how to navigate this sort of space disadvantage. This is something you really need to come into the game sort of knowing. So I played knight d5, you can also play b3, and I was sort of black will probably play queen a5, and maybe this is good for white, but I'd rather avoid this, so I just played knight d5, and now of course there's a positional threat. If black does nothing, I'm going to take, and we're going to make all these exchanges when black now has doubled f pawns, but moreover an isolated d pawn not something black really wants to allow, so there's essentially a decision I'm forcing black to make. Either they're going to take somehow on d5, or they're going to play knight d7, in which case again I don't want to trade off dark sword bishops. I'm going to avoid that, and I did that with bishop e3 in the game. I should also note that in both of these cases where black takes on d5, during the game I was actually thinking, so this one I was definitely planning on taking this way, and like if we have all these exchanges, I thought that this sort of position would be pretty good for white. I can just bring my rooks to the c and b files, get in c5, and I didn't really see how black was going to stop white from doing that. Maybe you could go b6, but then this weakens this. Maybe I can go a4, a5 then. Like, all in all, it just looked very, very unpleasant. But yeah, who knows? Maybe this was a way to go for black, trying to exchange all these minor pieces. Also, I should say bishop takes d5. This would probably soon transpose into the game after e takes d5, knight d7, and like bishop e3. Also, considering the game actually c takes d5, also you might be asking, why not c takes d5 here? The problem is when you trade off the same minor pieces, I think that this sort of symmetrical structure, well, not quite symmetrical, but you get what I mean, is a lot easier for black to hold. They can bring their queen to a5, double rooks up on the c file. Maybe I can play b4 for now and somewhat restrict that, but like queen c7 still. It feels very difficult to actually pose black some legitimate problems, whereas after bishop e takes c takes d5 rather, knight d7, bishop e3, this long-term advantage of the bishop here really restricts black's sort of ease of how they can play on the queen side, and white's probably, you know, gonna move a rook to the b file, play a4, a5, maybe b4, b5, you know, just have a lovely long-term advantage. But the problem with this whole line was I thought black could maybe play f5 in this position, and one thing you have to watch out for is you don't really want this structure after takes, because it's very difficult to hold this e4 pawn, and also when you get this sort of structure with the, I don't know if we'd call it the pawn backward, but maybe we could call it that, e pawn, then the knight can easily sit in the e5 square. There's all sorts of nice outposts for the black pieces. I didn't really like this at all. Maybe also you can bring knight c5 and attack the pawn like that. Really, I just didn't find that so appealing. Maybe you could take, this feels like the most logical decision, trying to avoid that sort of pawn on e4 getting created as a weakness. But even here I thought that maybe knight f6, just attack this pawn. It did feel quite unpleasant. Okay, I saw some tactical tricks maybe I could go for, where takes bishop c4 as a thing. But you know, they're also not forced to take, and maybe they can play rook h5, and quite possibly I still have an advantage. Basically, all of this just felt very unnecessary to me. Like, maybe I can play g4 in this exact position, try and trap the rook or something, because again, takes bishop c4. But like, this isn't even forced necessarily, like, you know, moving to the side of the rook. You could even go backwards, and I mean, again, maybe I'm better, but with this isolated e-pawn, I felt it definitely a little bit iffy. Which, coming back to this position, I mean, my opponent didn't play bishop takes d5 immediately. They first played knight d7, and that gave me a little bit more time to think about this position. And I think it was only in this position, or right before my opponent played bishop takes d5, that I really started to notice the consequences of taking on d5 and f5, and you know, the whole thing I just explained, which is why I played e takes d5 instead, creating a bit more of an asymmetrical structure. And we had some following moves from our opponent: rook ab1, queen b8, and basically what's going on. And what I will say is that black has a very difficult time finding a plan in this position in general. They'd like to go b5, but they always have to be careful that I can't just take, and that pawn becomes a weakness there, right? And as for white's plan, our plan is very straightforward. We eventually want to crash through on the queen side with b4, c5, and maybe we'll also utilize the open or semi-open e file to target this weak e7 pawn. Maybe we'll even storm the king side pawns up one day. But in general, it definitely felt to me during the game, in addition to the fact we have the bishop here, that white was just clearly better. However, I felt like during the game that I had to be a little bit prophylactic in this position, because, you know, I very clearly saw that my opponent's idea was to, you know, bring a rook to c8 and maybe try and go for b5 at some point, trying to gain some counterplay on the queen side. And initially I was just thinking, you know, bring a rook to c1, you go b4, and life should be good. We can't go c5 necessarily immediately. Maybe if black ever plays knight e5 trying to attack it, then we can go c5, which does make things a little bit difficult for black, because they want to attack this guy, at least sort of in theory they do, but whenever they do this, then they lose control of this square and we can push c5. So it is a bit of a waiting game. Maybe it could even go b6. But during the game, I was sort of hallucinating a bit with like b5 maybe in this position. Maybe it wasn't exactly this one. Because after takes, and say we have the following line after like takes, this pawn is a bit weak, and it does feel like white can probably somehow attack it, but you know, it's not exactly clear how to do that in position. I go queen d3, for example, there might be rook c3 attacking this guy, and if queen takes b5, rook takes e3, and I'm actually just losing material because I take this is hanging, and if I take this, well, again, I'm just down a piece in this position. So that really felt like it'd be allowing unnecessary counterplay. Again, I can't really play c5, and maybe I can somehow gang up on the pawn, but it just wasn't clear to me in the game how I could do that. Which is why I played a very prophylactic move, queen a5. Just simply taking I at this square, also stopping anything like b6, because now queen takes a6, and it might look like you can win back a pawn temporarily, but unfortunately the knight in d7 is just hanging. This is actually going to be a bit relevant later, as we will see, but nonetheless what happened in this position was rook fc8, b3, another very prophylactic move. I could have even just played this. There was some reason in the game I had for playing b3, I can't quite remember it though. Now my opponent started doing a bit of a weird king walk. I brought my rook to c1, they went king e8. And I'll be honest, during the game I had no idea what my opponent was doing. I thought they were just, you know, like throwing the king around the board, they didn't know what to do. But then after king f1, which I played, which had an idea by the way, my idea was I wanted to play b4. But again, b5 I thought was quite annoying. Maybe it's actually just bad, like after something like takes and b takes c4. But I remember during the game seeing like c takes b5, bishop d4 is actually quite annoying, because if I ever take this, well now the rook on c1 isn't protected, and black is just simply winning material, right? And obviously if I take the bishop on d4, take the rook on c7, then they get the intermediate check, and then they're just like winning the piece. And who knows, maybe with my passed pawns after something like takes, or like you take first, and then something like takes, I'm still like somehow winning, although I actually doubt it with like the dark square blockade. But you know, obviously being a piece down this position, I'm sure with some pawns to compensate for it, it would be definitely preferable to go for something where you have a more clear-cut positional advantage, which is why I played king f1. Now sort of preparing the fact that after b4 I can meet b5, because takes bishop d4, I can play rook takes c7 without having to worry about this sort of intermediate check. But one thing that I'd like to bring up, right, is remember how a couple moves ago the king was on g8, right? And now it's just on e8. Well, it might kind of seem like that's irrelevant. What's the king doing on e8, right? Well, actually it did serve a purpose after my opponent's next move, b6. But now before, remember how he could take, go queen b5, and after rook takes a2, there was queen takes d7. But now the problem is queen takes d7 isn't possible. Well, technically it's legal, but you don't really want to give up the queen for no reason, right? And in all likelihood, right, I'm sure white is still better, but it just seemed extremely unnecessary to make this exchange of pieces. I felt that if anyone gained something out of the open a file, it's black, because how is white really going to put a rook on a1 and contest that control of the a file with the bishop on g7? Clear to me. That's why in the game I instead played queen a4, sort of keeping a bit of an eye on this pawn on a6 and also keeping this knight pinned. Queen a7 happened, and again I played king f2, and again I played a somewhat not a prophylactic move here with king f2. The idea this time being that I thought b5 maybe was my opponent's idea. I'm pretty sure that it's not actually dangerous, but like one line I was saying looking at was something like b4, b5, takes, bishop e3, a3, and they can stick a bishop into b2, maybe like somehow attack this pawn even maybe. And it just seems super unnecessary, because like, okay, I can try and attack the pawn, but then bishop b2 again, that seems a little bit something I don't want to have to deal with. Rook c2, and maybe even knight b6, sorry, knight b6, that's terrible. But even if black just holds this position, it wasn't clear to me how I was making progress. This square is sufficiently covered. I'd never want to go b5 because that would leave a terrible hole in the c5 square. And this bishop is just kind of being a pain in the ass right now. And if I don't know, black just plays some random waiting move and I try to go bishop c1, then they can probably just take, and now go knight b6. And not only are they threatening knight takes c4, which, I mean, remember, before when we had the dark bishop on e3, we could always play c5, but now it's sufficiently covered, they can just take it. And they can also not only just play knight takes c4, but also maybe a knight takes d5. So again, another prophylactic move, king f2, now trying to avoid the whole b5 thing. Since now after this I can just simply take, and there's no bishop d4 to be worried about, unlike in some other variations, because I can, you know, my queen is covering the square. But if it wasn't, that actually would be something to be looking out for. So what happened in the game was f5, a bit of a tricky attempt to, like, if I just played some random move, f4, and b5 would be quite problematic. So what I did was I played queen b4, king f7, queen d2, just sort of regrouping, deciding that, you know, my queen doesn't belong on the queen side, it's feeling a little bit out of place there now. And what happened was a5. And here I was sort of, I made a very, what to some may look like a controversial decision. What I did was I decided to play this move a4, and essentially just completely paralyze the queenside now. And I feel like I might have seen some idea like this before that somehow inspired this move, but it definitely wasn't easy for me to play this, because very natural was a3, you don't really, because after you play a move like a4, you never really want to go b4, unless like, you know, something for very like concrete reasons, at least like in this position. If black just played some random move, I wouldn't go b4, because now I have this isolated a pawn, sort of backward c4 pawn, whole on c5. Black is probably absolutely fine in this position. So basically, I'm jettisoning my whole like queenside plan, which the last like 10 or so moves of my play seem to have just been revolving around completely, in order to also at the same time completely eliminate all of black's play on the queenside. And instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start maneuvering my pieces, like maneuvering the bishop this way to target the kingside, play g4, h4 eventually, and launch a kingside attack actually, in big part thanks to this move f5, which my opponent played earlier. This f5 move, definitely while it was tactically a bit tricky, I think strategically perhaps this was a bit of a mistake from my opponent. But also I should note, like what's so bad about like a3 and b4 in this position? Well, the problem was again that I felt like when the a file was getting opened, that now if my opponent just sort of doubled down on this and brought all their pieces to, once again, the a file, that it wasn't clear how I could really contest that. Like, I'm not going to be able to go rook c2, I can never put a rook onto the a1 square, so that pretty much eliminates all hope, let's say, of, you know, once again, using the a file for some sort of my own benefit. And meanwhile, it's not exactly clear how I can never break through c5. That also looks quite difficult to achieve. Black has a lot of control over that square. So basically, I wasn't sure if I even had an advantage, to be honest, despite on the surface it seeming like I should, which is why I just decided to, again, abandon this whole plan of going for a3, b4, and instead go a4, which instinctively for some reason didn't feel quite right, but at the same time concretely looking at these positions after, you know, they bring all their pieces to the a file and I can't contest it really. I mean, again, I could play bishop d4, but I don't really want to trade off dark squared bishops, remember? At least not now, I really thought. So that's why I played a4 basically, which this really felt like sort of the start of where like this whole game just became really cool in my opinion. So essentially we had some shuffling around the next few moves because, you know, obviously the queen side, no play is really going to be occurring there. So I started organizing some of my forces on the king side. I went for the g4 break. I should also note I didn't quite want to go g4 immediately. Well, in this position it fails tactically because of knight e4, right? So that's why I played h3 first, so that I can recapture with the h pawn instead of the g1, sorry, f1 rather. And after king g8, king g2, my opponent tries to bring his queen around to the king side. I maneuver my bishop to the c2 square, where it is on a much better diagonal than this one. King h8 happened. Again, I'm just reorganizing all my pieces, queen d1. And basically, my move queen d1, this was, and the last few moves in general, they're not doing anything necessarily like too forcing. Notice how I'm not rushing into like taking this f5 pawn or anything like that. I'm just sort of keeping the tension, keeping the pressure on my opponent, slowly reorganizing, improving all my pieces. Maybe, for example, I'm preparing something like rook h1. Like if I did that now, that could be quite risky because something like queen f3 check would happen. And, you know, I would much rather avoid something like this. This is completely unnecessary to allow. Whereas now after queen d1, like, the f3 square is covered, so I can freely go for stuff like rook h1, and again, like black, they have to be careful. If they go for something like 95 maybe, I was thinking I could maybe just go f4, g5, and now I control a lot of this knight squares. The bishop can't also go to any of these sort of squares, and I'm just going to steamer up the board with, like, you know, doubling up on the h file, h4, h5, eventually taking. It's pretty difficult to believe I'm just not, like, easily winning there. So this might have been what motivated my opponent's next move, which is to play f4. And I thought this was a mistake during the game, but at the same time, maybe allowing f4 is also just pretty bad. I haven't checked with Engine, by the way, any of this game. I'm just going off of what I thought during it. But the reason I thought this move was a mistake, because now I, of course, moved the bishop somewhere, maybe also like d2 or c1 could have been possible, but I went f2 for now, just keeping an eye on this b6 pawn, keeping this knight sort of stuck to the defense of it. Because now, essentially, when we play f4, what we do is we just open the bishop up on this diagonal, where its influence is just much more exaggerated compared to what it was before, which led me to believe that I should have a pretty big, just, well, increased advantage, I guess is the way I should put it, compared to when the pawn was back on f5, right? But anyways, going on, f4 is what happened. bishop f2, bishop e5, just sort of putting the bishop on the square or blocks my rook on the e file. It's fairly sensible. I go rook h1, not even coming to h4 yet. This is one thing I was doing, which maybe it doesn't make a huge difference, but it's just to always keep my opponent guessing, especially because in this point he was in time trouble. Like, he only had a couple minutes on the clock at this point. I had maybe like 15 or so. And the thing you have to understand is, in general, just these sorts of positions to play with black, they're very, very unpleasant. It's, you never know what your opponent's going to do necessarily. They have all the options, and you just sort of have to play all the right moves consistently and do this while you're low on time. Like, that's very difficult. If you've ever experienced this sort of defense, you know it's an absolute just nightmare to go through. But anyways, I played rook h1, h6 happened, bishop b1, just sort of making a bit of room for my queen maybe to go on this diagonal, and once again, you know, target the g6 pawn maybe, and just in general put some pressure on the black king. So what happened was king g7, queen d3, rook g8, 4. I finally played this move. And queen f6 is what happens. And this was a very provocative move, because when your queen steps into f6, you're essentially asking white to hit you with this move g5. But I didn't really want to play this immediately, because something like takes, this comes with check. If I were to sack the pawn, I played something like king f1 first, and then remaneuvered my king around to the e2 square. Like, now g5 is something I'm really interested in playing, because after, well, my opponent played rook c8, now this might have even been winning, I'm not too sure, I haven't analyzed with an engine yet, I didn't go for it in the game, but it was super tempting to go for this, right? Getting all these tempi, and maybe I go rook h7. I think what sort of put me off of this in the end was that I just couldn't really find like a queen win in any of these positions. Like, sure, I can take and win back the pawn. I am trading off a lot of pieces, and you really want to make sure when you're trading all these pieces off that you actually are winning and just not making the position more drawish. And I wasn't super confident of that. So again, I didn't see the need to make this huge committal decision to, you know, play g5 myself and sack a pawn and potentially just liquidate the position. So I instead played rook eg1. And now, of course, my opponent doesn't want to. The only conditions in which he'd allow g5 is if he's potentially winning the pawn or something, or at the very least trading a bunch of pieces off in the process. Now, if he allows g5 tempo like this, it's just game over. So he played, sorry, not g5, but queen g7 himself. Now, with g5, h5, and he can keep the position a bit more closed. But I instead want to go for h5 and weaken the light squares significantly, potentially also using this f5 square for something like a queen or bishop in the future. And around this position, I was feeling just super confident. The whole game in general, to be honest, like, since the opening where I got the Maroczy bind and all that stuff, I was just feeling great. So the whole game, I just feel like the momentum's been in my hands. I've just been controlling everything, and my opponent's just sort of been having to respond to all the things I'm throwing at him. And like, some of you might look at this sort of position and you'll think, Sam, like, this is another fucking drawn position. Like, how are you going to break through, right? You can't go b4. Well, you sort of can. Like, this is something that's always in the cards, but you sort of have to time it concretely in such a way that it's really sort of breaking through concretely and whatnot. But I always had that in my back pocket, right? But moreover, with all these like weak light squares, I felt that, you know, I could potentially penetrate into my opponent's camp or something like that. In this position, actually, I spent some time even calculating this. I actually thought, like, when we first went to this, I was just winning straight up, because I was calculating, for example, like, if knight f6, then I just go this and I win a rook. And if bishop f6 takes and queen f6 takes, but for some reason I just forgot about king e8 in this position where, yeah, this one, when he's just sort of holding stuff together. Like, I can sort of give some checks, but it doesn't really lead anywhere, to be honest. At least, you know, not that I have seen during the game or with my human eyes yet. Maybe the engine will prove me wrong, but instead I just decided to be patient, bring my rook back, not rook, but queen, back to the d1 square, opening this diagonal up for the bishop where it can potentially be a bit of a pain in the ass. So I went to bishop g6 check, keeping the king locked on the king side for now, not allowing it to go over to the queen side. Not that the queen side is necessarily safe, because there's always b4 stuff, so maybe the king side is safer, but still not necessarily completely safe. So what I did was I played king f1. Now the king side's completely locked, right? I'm not worried at all about the king being located here. There's just no way it's going to be in any danger, so I decide to do that, remaneuvering around. Rook e1, doubling up on the e file. And just notice, you know, like, I'm in complete control of everything. I'm the one who gets to call the shots. My opponent has to respond. Like, I just want to keep reiterating that, because it's really important to understand. It might seem like sort of nothing much is going on. We're just sort of flinging the pieces around the board. But there's all sorts of things that, you know, black has to be wary of. Like, for example, sacking the exchange on e5. It might not seem very dangerous right now, but trust me when I say that that's an idea that black has to be constantly looking out for, calculating each move. And when you're in time trouble, that's incredibly difficult to do. So rook d8, what happened? Again, just shuffling around. I played bishop b1, boom, queen c2, d1. Might seem a little bit strange, like I just doubled up on the e file. What could I want if my rook couldn't do in d1, this closed file? Just shuffling the pieces around a bit, bringing the bishop to a different diagonal this time, not immediately to something like c3. But I'm just recognizing it's not doing much on the f2 square right now, so I'm improving it a little bit. Knight d7 is what happened, bishop d2, knight f6, and in this position I almost threw away the game, I think. Because essentially what I did is I played rook d1, but what I essentially somehow missed was that my opponent could play knight takes d5. And it's quite possible actually, because my opponent's position is so bad, that I'm still better here. Or at least not like in danger of losing, I would say. But it was extremely stupid of me to overlook something like this. Just, I guess because the whole game there weren't many of, I mean there were always these tactical possibilities I was looking out for, but at least since we've gone to this sort of very close position, my mind just completely switched off with regards to tactics, and it was only when I played my move that I was like, holy shit, did I just allow my opponent to save the game? But luckily my opponent being time trouble, I don't know whether he trusted me or just didn't see knight takes d5, I find that hard to imagine. He played rook f8 in this position. But then I noticed that, you know, this was still a threat, and that actually, even if I just play something like this, now I have to watch out for knight takes g4 because it takes f3. But I was very lucky, maybe he just missed my next move, queen f5, that I could defend not only against knight takes d5, because now I have queen e6 intermediate check, but also this is not an issue because I obviously just take this. And that left my opponent very hard pressed for his next move, essentially after queen f5, to really find something to do. He played king h8 with a couple seconds left on the clock, I think. But now remember again what I was saying earlier about taking on e5. Well, that's what I did in this position. I decided to sack the exchange. But it didn't even really feel like a sacrifice to me because I was just so convinced that that bishop was the glue of his position holding everything together, and that it was worth well more than just a rook and a pawn for me to sort of give up material like this. Because now I can bring my bishop to the c3 square, influence pressure over this diagonal. The e file is very easy to sort of, well, use now because there's no bishop clog in it. I can target this pawn, I can bring my queen to maybe the e6 and target b6. And not to mention the bishop pair working together is just absolutely lethal. And to be honest, to put it in French, I think black is probably just fucked at this point. Not that they weren't already, but now it's really just to a whole new level. Like I thought maybe, you know, my opponent should have tried to bring his knight back to d7 or something like that to try and better defend against these threats. But yeah, maybe I would go like queen e6 or something in this position. And if like queen f7, then I can take on h6. And if he goes to like h8 or something, maybe I can somehow get my bishop involved. I don't know, there's probably something, right? Like maybe I can even sack an exchange here, I don't know, and do something like this. Though in this position feels a little bit sketchy because rook f6, but you know, I trusted that I would probably make something work. I don't know, maybe if my opponent defends perfectly, maybe even Stockfish can't win this, I don't know. But luckily for us humans, we are also usually playing human opponents who aren't perfect at defending, especially when they're playing on a 30-second increment. So that's why I was able to crack through here. Queen takes e5. And despite the fact I'm technically down material, I am absolutely certain that this is just completely winning. If I turn the engine on, probably say +5, +6. It's just absolutely terrible for black. So rook b7, bishop c3. And I actually spent a bit of time on this move because at first I wasn't sure after knight e8 if this was actually good or not, because I essentially can't avoid a queen trade now. I can't move my queen anywhere and also keep this bishop protected at the same time. So initially I actually wasn't going to play bishop c3 despite it looking like such a natural move. And I also have to be careful, like I was thinking maybe I'll play something like queen e2 and then play bishop c3, but I was like, oh, knight takes g4, that doesn't look so good. But bishop c3, what I noticed was that I started calculating concretely. This is one thing I always preach in this channel, you know, when you sort of hit a roadblock in your calculation, don't give up immediately. You try and look one move deeper, see if you're missing something. Very often you uncover what it was like that makes the variation work, and that's what I did here. I noticed that, okay, if I just take this, do I have something in this position? Eventually I saw rook e6, I'm pretty sure is just winning. I attack this. Of course they can't take due to the pin, and they also can't play king h7 because, well, that's illegal. My bishop's covering that square. If I grab this and then bring my rook back to the g6 square, I was pretty certain that black is absolutely toast in that position. But yeah, what instead happened after bishop c3 was not much actually. Like I just grabbed a bunch of pawns. My opponent put up very little resistance at this point, very difficult to as well. I should note, by the way, I could have like taken potentially and won a rook on d7. And then I pieced up in a bunch of pawns. Like this must be winning, but I was like, he gets checks, he gets counterplay. I don't want to have to calculate anything in time trouble. at all. So I just decided to play bishop e6 check, bring my queen back, potentially targeting this diagonal, rook a7, a5. In this position, my opponent just resigned. There's literally not anything he can do at all. I'm going to be pushing all these pawns forward. I have the bishop here, a rook, a queen that can, you know, attack his king and stuff. So basically on this move, after move 71 and like 4 and whatever hours of playing this game, managed to wrap up a pretty nice win. Especially since at this point in the tournament I had got 4 draws, no losses so far. I was in 5 out of 7. 2 more rounds to go at this point. And I was feeling very good after the win. Unfortunately, the tournament didn't exactly carry off on the best note possible, but you know, definitely like this just had to go down, as especially considering like the psychological element of who I was playing and like, you know, the past history I've had with this opponent. Like I was very just happy to play this sort of like very clean, just positional, like I mean I don't want to get too high up on my like horses and whatnot, but I would say it's fair to say like to call it a positional masterpiece, at least for my low standards. But yeah, anyways, I hope you guys have found this instructive, useful. If any of it was even the slightest bit useful, please leave a like on the video and also subscribe to the channel for more content like this if you're not already. Also, check out my stuff in the description below. I offer coaching and also I have a free newsletter. But anyways, I hope you guys found this useful. Hope you have a good day.